The CNN studio fell dead silent as former House Speaker Newt Gingrich launched what he believed would be a devastating attack on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. His weathered face twisted into that familiar smirk he had perfected over decades of political warfare, the same expression that had once intimidated countless politicians on Capitol Hill. But what happened next stunned everyone watching. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not stutter or stumble over her words like so many others had when facing Gingrich's legendary rhetorical assaults. Instead, she delivered a response so cold, so calculated, and so brutally effective that it left the 80-year-old political veteran speechless for the first time in his career. The studio lights seemed to dim around Gingrich as his confident demeanor crumbled in real time. Within minutes of her response, Jan Crockett Destroys and was trending worldwide with millions of Americans sharing clips of the moment that would reshape how political confrontations are viewed in modern America. This was not just another political debate between talking heads arguing over policy details that most viewers would forget by morning. This was the moment a young black congresswoman from Texas showed America that the old guard's intimidation tactics no longer worked. This was generational warfare playing out live on television with millions watching as decades of political assumptions were shattered in a matter of minutes. And Newt Gingrich, the man who once brought down a Democratic speaker, who revolutionized Republican politics with his aggressive tactics, who had made a career out of demolishing opponents with surgical precision, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The predator was about to become the prey. Before we dive into how Jasmine Crockett dismantled one of politics' most notorious fighters, and I mean completely destroyed him in a way that political insiders are still talking about, you need to understand this was a masterclass in political combat that will change how you view power dynamics in Washington forever. The camera operators seemed to sense the historical significance of the moment, zooming in on Gingrich's face as the color drained from it, and he realized he had just made a massive mistake. His eyes darted around the studio as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist, but it was too late. The trap had already been sprung and Crockett had already won before most viewers even realized the battle had begun. To understand why this confrontation was so devastating, you need to know who these two people really are and why this moment mattered so much to the future of American political discourse. This was not just a random clash between two politicians. It was a collision between two completely different worlds, two different eras, and two fundamentally different approaches to power. Newt Gingrich walked into that CNN studio thinking he was facing just another young Democrat he could easily intimidate with his reputation and decades of experience. At 80 years old, he had been playing political hardball since before Jasmine Crockett was even born. This is the man who orchestrated the Republican Revolution of 1994, who brought down Democratic Speaker Jim Wright through relentless investigation and pressure, and who turned political combat into an art form that Republicans still study today. Gingrich had built his entire career on a simple but effective formula. Present yourself as the smartest person in the room. Use historical references to demonstrate your intellectual superiority. Ask loaded questions designed to trap your opponent, and then watch them squirm as they try to escape your rhetorical snares. His strategy was devastatingly simple. Appear scholarly and reasonable, while delivering attacks so precise and brutal that opponents look foolish, extreme, or completely out of their depth. For decades, this approach had worked flawlessly. Politicians would enter debates or interviews with Gingrich thinking they could match his intellect or rhetorical skills, only to find themselves twisted into knots by his relentless questioning and superior preparation. He made a career out of making other people look stupid, while positioning himself as the wise elder statesman who understood the deep currents of American politics. But Jasmine Crockett is not your typical target, and this was never going to be a typical political ambush. The 43-year-old congresswoman from Dallas came to Washington with a background that prepared her for exactly this kind of intellectual and political combat, as before entering politics, she was a civil rights attorney who had spent years going toe-to-toe with powerful opponents in courtrooms across Texas, where intimidation tactics and condescending attitudes were standard weapons used against young black lawyers. Crockett had faced down hostile judges who questioned her competence based on her age and race, and had gone up against aggressive prosecutors who tried to overwhelm her with their experience and connections. She had battled corporate lawyers who thought they could bulldoze her with their prestigious law firm credentials and Ivy League degrees. And in every case, She had learned that the only way to win was through superior preparation, unshakable confidence, and the ability to turn an opponent's arrogance against them. Crockett had also honed her political instincts in the brutal environment of the Texas legislature, where she had already proven she could handle veteran politicians who underestimated her based on her age, race, and gender. She made a name for herself by asking pointed questions that exposed hypocrisy and by forcing uncomfortable conversations about race and inequality that many politicians wanted to avoid at all costs. Her rise through Texas politics had been meteoric, but had also been hard-won. Starting as a public defender representing clients who could not afford high-powered attorneys, she had seen firsthand how the system worked against ordinary people. She had watched wealthy defendants walk free, while poor clients faced harsh sentences for similar crimes, and had seen how zip codes determined the quality of legal representation, and how race and class influenced every aspect of the criminal justice system. When she transitioned into civil rights law, Crockett took on cases that other attorneys avoided, like police brutality, employment discrimination, and voting rights violations. She went up against police departments, major corporations, and government agencies, always representing the underdog against powerful institutions that seemed impossible to defeat. Her entry into politics had been driven by frustration with the pace of change of the courts, as she realized that real systemic transformation required getting inside the system and fighting from within. Her campaigns had been grassroots affairs powered by small donations and volunteers who believed in her message of justice and equality. The stakes of this particular confrontation were enormous and extended far beyond a television studio, because this was not happening in some backroom committee hearing that only political junkies and C-SPAN addicts would watch. This was primetime CNN with millions of viewers tuning in to see how the new generation of Democratic leaders would handle attacks from Republican veterans with decades of experience in political warfare. The timing made it even more significant, as the country was deeply divided along racial, generational, and ideological lines, and trust in institutions was at historic lows. Young Americans, particularly young Americans of color, were increasingly skeptical of traditional political processes and leaders, and many felt the system was rigged against them and that their voices did not matter in Washington. More importantly, this confrontation represented a clash between two fundamentally different eras of American politics and two completely different theories of how power should function in a democracy. Gingrich represented the old-school approach where seniority, connections, and institutional knowledge gave you the power to control narratives and intimidate opponents, while Crockett represented the new generation that refuses to be intimidated, that fights back with facts and moral clarity, and that is not afraid to call out hypocrisy regardless of who is delivering it. The setup was perfect for drama, with an 80-year-old white man with decades of political experience facing off against a 43-year-old black woman who had been in Congress for less than 2 years. On paper, it looked like a mismatch, and Gingrich probably thought it would be easy, but he was about to learn how wrong he was. The tension started building the moment both guests were introduced on Anderson Cooper 360 as the studio lighting cast sharp shadows across the CNN set, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere that seemed perfect for political drama about to unfold. Cooper set the stage by discussing the latest controversy over voting rights legislation, a topic that had been dominating headlines for weeks and dividing America along predictable partisan lines. And the background of this confrontation was crucial to understanding why the stakes were so high, because Republicans across the country had been pushing new voting restrictions they claimed were necessary to prevent fraud, while Democrats argued these measures were thinly veiled attempts to suppress turnout in communities of color. The debate had been raging in state legislatures and Congress and in courtrooms across America, with both sides claiming the moral high ground. Gingrich came out swinging, immediately his confidence evident in every gesture and inflection. His opening statement was classic Gingrich, a carefully crafted mixture of historical references designed to showcase his intellectual credentials, dire warnings about the future of democracy, and thinly veiled accusations designed to put Democrats on the defensive before they could even present their own argument. Anderson, what we are seeing here is the most radical attempt to federalize elections in American history. Gingrich began his voice carrying that professorial tone he had perfected over decades of political combat. He gestured with his hands like a lecturer addressing students, his body language conveying absolute certainty in his position. These Democrats want to eliminate basic security measures that have protected our democracy for generations. They want to make it impossible to verify who is actually voting where they're voting and whether they're even eligible to vote in the first place. The words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable and measured, but they carried an implicit accusation that Democrats were trying to enable massive voter fraud. It was a classic Gingrich move, make explosive claims while maintaining a calm, scholarly demeanor that made opposition arguments seem hysterical by comparison. Crockett listened quietly from across the studio, taking notes on a legal pad, her expression neutral. But the camera occasionally cut to her during Gingrich's opening remarks, and viewers could see that she had clearly come prepared for this fight. Her posture was confident, but not aggressive, professional, but not deferential. She looked like someone who had heard these arguments before and knew exactly how to respond to them. Cooper turned to her for a response, and Crockett delivered a measured rebuttal that laid out the facts about voting access and security with the precision of a seasoned litigator presenting evidence to a jury. She spoke about voter suppression tactics that have been documented in courtrooms across the country, about how certain communities have been systematically excluded from the political process through a combination of legal barriers and intimidation tactics, and about the urgent need for federal protections to ensure every American could exercise their constitutional right to vote without fear or obstruction. Her response was factual, passionate, and compelling, delivered with the confidence of someone who had studied these issues not just as academic concepts, but as lived realities affecting her constituents. She cited specific statistics about polling place closures, voter registration purges, and the disproportionate impact of various voting restrictions on communities of color and young voters. But Gingrich was not done with his prepared attack strategy. He had been waiting patiently for his chance to spring the rhetorical trap. He had been setting up since the beginning of the segment the kind of loaded question that had destroyed countless political careers over the decades. Congresswoman Crockett Gingrich interrupted, his tone shifting to that condescending register he used when he thought he had someone cornered and was about to deliver a devastating blow. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had used this exact technique hundreds of times before with great success. Let me ask you a simple question that should be easy for someone in your position to answer. You talk a lot about voting rights and suppression, but can you name one specific person who was actually prevented from voting in the last election because of these so-called suppression tactics you keep talking about? The question was vintage Gingrich, carefully crafted to put Crockett in what seemed like an impossible position no matter how she responded. If she could not name specific individuals, he would claim that voter suppression was nothing more than a Democratic talking point with no basis in reality. And if she did provide examples, he would attack the credibility of those cases, argue they were isolated incidents blown out of proportion, or claim that any voting difficulties were due to individual mistakes rather than systemic problems. But Crockett did not take the bait. Instead, she smiled slightly and said, "Mr. Gingrich, that is an interesting question. Let me ask you one in return. Can you name one case of the kind of massive voter fraud that you and your party claim justifies making it harder for people to vote?" The studio audience stirred, and Cooper raised an eyebrow, because this was not how these exchanges usually went. Typically, when a veteran like Gingrich asked a gotcha question, the younger politician would get flustered and defensive. Gingrich's expression hardened because he was not used to having his questions turned back on him, especially not by someone he clearly considered beneath his political weight class. "Well, that is not what I asked you," he replied, his voice taking on an edge. "I asked you a specific question about voter suppression. Can you answer it, or can't you?" The condescension was now unmistakable. Gingrich was using the tone you would use with a child who was not paying attention in class. It was a deliberate attempt to make Crockett look inexperienced and unprepared. Crockett's expression did not change, but something shifted in her posture. She sat up straighter, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a new intensity. "I can absolutely answer your question, Mr. Gingrich, but I think it is telling that you cannot.